Great, and I'd like to welcome everyone again to the Regency PTAC nonprofit webinar on emotional intelligence. Our presenter today is Eloiza Altoro. Eloiza is an experienced nonprofit consultant. You had the ability to view her bio in your registration material, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. I think at this point, I would like to turn things over to Eloiza.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Once again, my name is Eloiza Altoro, and I welcome you all to this webinar today. I'm very excited to talk about emotional intelligence and how it relates to communication. Just some logistics up front from my end. If you have any technical issues as far as being able to hear the audio, or if something is happening kind of funny with the PowerPoint, just put something into the chat or to the questions section so that we can flag that and deal with any of those technical difficulties ahead of time. The other thing is that instead of waiting till the very end as it relates to questions, I'm open to questions throughout the presentation. So as you put the questions in and there's natural breaks, Courtney will be sharing those questions and I'd be happy to answer them. Also comments or experiences, whatever you want to share, that would be great, and I'd highly encourage that. Lastly, there's going to be some opportunity to give some of your feedback and some very specific questions that I have. So just encouraging you all, and if you're in a room with a bunch of people, maybe just get some of that feedback and share with us some of your thoughts as the questions come along. So I'll go ahead and move forward. Alrighty then. Sorry, already having issues with that advance, but there we go. Okay, so just going to go through some of the objectives outcomes really quick. The first one is to define emotional intelligence, and you'll hear either EQ or IQ, and I'll talk about the difference, but I'm going to use those somewhat interchangeably, and I'll define what those are and explain them to you in a moment. The next one is understand the differences between EQ and IQ/EI. Understand the 5 main features of emotional intelligence. Explore tips and resources on how to improve your emotional intelligence. And lastly, examine the 3 working generations and how it impacts emotional intelligence. So that's kind of the flow of today's webinar. First thing that we'll do is go through defining emotional intelligence. And I found a couple definitions that I thought were really good in sharing, establishing context to what we mean around emotional intelligence, especially for today's webinar. So the first one is emotional intelligence, otherwise known as emotional quotient, which is the difference between EI and EQ, as far as the acronyms, is the ability to understand, use, and manage your own emotions in positive ways to relieve stress, communicate effectively, empathize with others, and overcome challenges and diffuse conflict. So we'll be going through that in a little bit more detail. And then the second definition is the capacity for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves, and for managing emotions well in ourselves and in other relationships. Now, this comes from the Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ by Dan Goleman. And he's kind of like the guru of emotional intelligence. So at the end of the presentation, I have some resources, and one of them is his book. If this is an area that really interests you and want to learn more about, you definitely can refer to that book and probably get some really good information in addition to what I'll be sharing today. So just kind of to summarize the emotional intelligence definition, there's 2 pieces to that. One is recognizing, understanding, and managing our own emotions. That's one piece of emotional intelligence. And then the other is recognizing, understanding, and influencing the emotions of others. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to really focus on those 2 factors. And we'll be breaking that up into a lot more detail. So this may sound easy, talking about understanding and managing our emotions, and then recognizing and understanding the emotions of others, but it's really not as easy as it sounds. There's many times where our instinct tends to react. We tend to react out of instinct, and our emotions just happen to play out, and we don't necessarily always understand them or can control them. So part of what we'll be talking today is some examples of how we can do that, why we need to do that, and some tips on how to manage those and maneuver those emotions and experiences and feelings with other people. So feelings play a big role in what we hear, how we hear it, and how we react in what we say. If we're angry, sad, or afraid, we may be able to control our verbal communication, but not always our nonverbal cues, which still affect the outcomes of our communication. So not only will we be talking about verbally, but also non-verbally and how that affects communication, and then the role that emotional intelligence plays in that. So in summary, emotional awareness, or the ability to understand your feelings, will help you to succeed when communicating with others. And then understanding how a person is communicating with you is more important than what is actually being said. I'm going to repeat that one more time because I think it's pretty profound when you start to think about that. Understanding how a person is communicating with you is more important than what is actually being said. And I can give a good example of that, actually, and I'm sure some of you may be able to relate. So I have a child who's special needs, and he's high functioning, but he actually suffers from anxiety and has some issues with ADD. And so he just started high school, and he's actually in his first year, or is going into his second year of high school, but the first year of high school is really rough. And what I noticed was he was having a really hard time with stress. And at the beginning, I was talking to him about, why is your homework not getting done? What's going on with all of your assignments? And I think I was putting a lot more pressure on him than I should have, but I was still learning, and he hadn't been diagnosed at the beginning of the year. So this was something that was relatively new to me, but we had many conversations where I'm literally just trying to coach him and help him through. And because he was so angry and upset and stressed just with the situation, he would tell me on the regular basis that he hated me. And so obviously as a parent, that's something where you get upset about that, and you feel really bad that your child is telling you they hate you. But I was able to learn that, 5 to 10, 15 minutes later, he was giving me kisses and hugs, and we were fine once again. So I realized that the words that were coming out of his mouth were not necessarily what he meant. He was just responding and reacting to emotions. And through my ability to be able to master and learn around emotional intelligence, helped me a lot in my situations, not only with dealing with him, but also the things that he says in those situations. So that would be an example of, how this is going to play out in what we're going to talk about next. But it's really a lot to do with the interactions between what you say and how you say it, and how people respond and what they say in turn. And this will be what we'll be focusing on. So the next slide is around emotional quotient, intelligence quotient, which is IQ, and many of you have heard of IQ before. And so if you've heard of IQ, really what that's talking about is measuring intelligence. And then EQ, which is emotional quotient or emotional intelligence, is actually measuring people's emotional skills and abilities and communication and those kinds of things. So one thing that is very clear is that a higher IQ does not necessarily assume that people are better at communicating. So, think about the smartest people that you know. Like, they're not always the best communicators in the room. But if you're not a good communicator, it hinders your ability to truly engage and build in meaningful relationships. Even people who are very much considered quote unquote people persons sometimes have a problem with committing to thoughtful communication and really being intentional and strategic about the conversations that they have with others. You may notice that sometimes people who are extremely smart or who have an IQ may not always be successful in relationships and in being socially adept. But that's why it's important that when we talk about intelligence, that we realize that IQ and EQ exist in tandem, and that in order to be, successful and effective as a person, and especially when it comes to building relationships, you have to have as much IQ as you have to have EQ, and they build off of one another. Just curious, are there any questions so far as we move forward?
No questions have come in so far. Just a reminder to people, if you do have a question, you can use that question box, or if you would like to ask your question verbally, press the little hand button next to your name, and that's my cue to know that you would like your line unmuted. But as of right now, we have none.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
So the next thing that I want to do is talk about the 5 features of emotional intelligence. And so the first one is self-awareness. And this is where you recognize your own emotions and how they affect your thoughts and behavior. You know your strengths and weaknesses, and you have self-confidence. The second one is managing emotions. You're able to control impulsive feelings and behaviors, manage your emotions in healthy ways, take initiatives, follow through on commitments, and adapt to changing circumstances. The next one is empathy. You understand the emotions, needs, and concerns of other people. You pick up on emotional cues, feel comfortable socially, and recognize the power dynamics in a group or organization. Then we have motivation. That's where you understand the intentions of your actions, words, and behaviors, and those of others. And then lastly, there's social skills. You know how to develop and maintain good relationships, communicate clearly, inspire and influence others, work well in a team, and manage conflict. So what I'll be doing in the next several slides is breaking down each of these areas and talking about examples, as well as giving some, suggestions or tips on how to increase these emotional intelligence. Any questions about the features in general?
Nothing has come in yet.
Okay. We'll keep moving forward, and if something comes in, let me know.
Okay, great.
So basically, the first one is self-awareness. Self-awareness is the ability to look at ourselves in the mirror and understand ourselves enough to be able to control our actions, our behaviors, our feelings when we deal with other people. Many times we're in denial about ourselves, and this gets in the way of us to be able to be open, truthful, and authentic with other people. So it's important that you're aware of how you come across to other people. Something to know about that is that, our nonverbal cues is a good indicator in that we might react or hear things, but then when other people hear it, maybe like the way we say something, how we say it, how loud we say it, makes a big difference in how people interpret what we're saying to them. But, some of the things to think about when you're talking to other people is in advance, knowing what messages are you sending, is what you're sending what you intend, and then to be aware of nonverbal cues as you're communicating with others. Also, self-awareness is a very intentional strategy. You need to be very aware of how you come across to others, and that you have to be mindful before you say things and how you say them, to put some thought and effort into that. One of the things in this area that's good to know is like your triggers, right? They're very important when it comes to self-awareness. For me, some of my triggers are like when people raise their voice or when they come off as very ingenuine. It tends to bring a reaction in me that, unless I think about it and I am very intentional about not reacting, I know in advance that those are my triggers. So for example, going back to the situation of my son, when he's very upset, he will raise his voice and he will start to yell. And I already know in advance that is one of my triggers. So what I try to do is I try to bring my voice down. I try to get calm. And of course I'm human, so it doesn't always work as a parent, but to the best of my abilities, I bring my voice down. I lower it and I try to de-escalate the situation by not raising my voice anymore, and helping him understand that if we're going to have a conversation, he needs to not yell, but to speak in a way that I will listen and that we can talk. So this is something that not only am I trying to teach him, but I'm also working on myself to be able to de-escalate my own triggers in these conversations and in these situations. Out of curiosity, this is one of those times where I'll ask some of you, what are some of the triggers that you all come across that you may or may not be aware of in your conversations that would be helpful to kind of explore more and think about ways on how you can address those triggers in communication and conversation. Do you want to take a moment to put some ideas or thoughts in the chat room or in the question section?
Perfect. So while we're waiting for some brave souls to put in the question box what they think some of their triggers are, I'm going to go ahead and read that first code word. And again, just a reminder: if you're listening to this live, you can just ignore this. But for those listening to the archive, the first code word is the word summer. 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 All right. Let's wait a couple more seconds just to.
And even if you don't want to share your triggers, you could also share some triggers that you've seen in people and reactions. I mean, I'm not going to point people's names out and say, hey, this is so-and-so's trigger, but just thought of the fact that we're mindful of triggers, and see if any of you have any other examples or thoughts to share.
Great. Well, we and I won't out anybody. We've had one brave soul here who has identified that their trigger is being interrupted, and I would concur with this individual. That is most certainly a trigger of mine as well.
That's very interesting. That's a good trigger. Go. Well, let me talk about this one really quick, and then I'll grab that one from you. Interestingly enough, about being interrupted, right? And a lot of people have that, but it's also a cultural thing. And it could be ethnic, but it also could be just different cultures. Like in some situations, you have people who culturally get really excited, and they're in boisterous families and in relationships where they're used to talking over each other. And it might not necessarily be looked at such a bad thing. So their intent, this is a great example actually, their intent might not be to disrespect you or to talk over you, but it's something that they're used to doing, and it could be a sign that they're excited or they just really want to share something, right? So this would be an example where it's like, okay, if it's a trigger of yours, then how can you effectively communicate that to someone else without it interacting or reacting in a negative way, but also share that, for me, when communicating, it's helpful when I can make my point without people talking over me, right? So that's actually a great example of just being aware of your trigger and being able to figure out how to effectively communicate your needs around that, as well as not being immediately wanting to respond in a negative way if somebody does, kind of talk over you. So what are some of the other things you're seeing there, Courtney?
Yeah, so we have two more that have come in. Actually, I lied, a couple more. So another one is someone is being demeaning to another individual. We have asking questions. I'm going to go ahead and assume that might be asking too many questions is the trigger.
Yeah.
And then the last one we have is lack of eye contact.
Those are all great examples. I'm going to just quickly refer to a couple of them. Number one, the eye contact is another good example of maybe cultural differences, whether it's maybe a young person who's talking to an older person and who might be intimidated. Also in specific cultures where I'm speaking more of traditional cultures and maybe some of the Asian cultures and Hispanic and Latino cultures, it could be disrespectful in some situations for someone to look at a person in the eye if they're in a role of authority or they're being reprimanded or things like that. So that's another example where, as we move forward and we talk more about some of these issues, where you could consider that as far as being your trigger, and maybe just understanding where people are and that it might not be something intentional to be disrespectful toward you, but there could be a reason or a purpose or even a cultural barrier as to why people may be doing that. So those are all great examples, and I appreciate you sharing. Each one of us, even though only a couple people shared, we all have triggers. It's normal. We're human. But, just in understanding that helps us a lot in our self-awareness. And then lastly, focusing on growing your strengths is an important piece, right? So what am I good at? How do I improve upon those strengths? Who or what can complement my strengths and to balance me out? And, this is very helpful in healthy relationship building. So where we're always told to look at our weaknesses and focus on our weaknesses, what I'm saying is that in self-awareness, it helps to really look at your strengths and to build upon that. And someone had given an example of someone who asked too many questions. So I'm going to give you an example of a situation where, focusing on strengths and then also, people who balance you out might be a way to look at it. When I ran an organization that was a national organization, I had one staff person under me. And this particular staff person had been with the organization for a long time. So I was relatively new, and she had been there for many, many, many years. And I'm the type of person as a manager where, like, I don't bother people. I let them do their own thing. And if they need me, my door's wide open, and I'm happy to respond, help out when needed. And so that works a lot with people who are really self-motivated and driven, who kind of don't mind doing their own thing. But in a situation where someone likes to have more direction and somebody to tell them what to do and how to do it and give them a lot more details, that style doesn't always work. So I had a person who, this particular individual who worked with me, she would come into my office every morning, and we would have like a 10, 15-minute conversation, really going through her day, talking about like what it is that she was going to do and some of her issues and all of that kind of stuff. And for me, it's like, I just wanted to come in the morning and start, working on my own to-do list and what I needed to do. But I realized that as an effective manager, I had to also be aware of her needs. And if I wanted to be able to support her as my staff person, I couldn't necessarily treat her like I wanted to be treated. I had to kind of move myself away and be able to support her. So even though, like, she asked a lot of questions and needed a lot of detail, and that was super annoying to me, just as a person, I had to let that go, put that to the side, and figure out how to help her by just listening, because that's all she wanted, was someone to listen to her and to validate that what she was doing for the day made sense, and that was it. So, that the other example is if somebody is asking you a lot of questions, it could be because they are someone who's very curious, who spends a lot of time in the inquiry mode in their head, and they need those answers. So maybe figuring out a way so that maybe they could ask the questions ahead of time, send them to you via email, or, just limit the amount of time that you have. I mean, there's probably different ways to look at that. But once again, versus it just triggering you, like, how can you meet the needs of other people that you have to interact and work with, or even be in relationships with, and still kind of meet your needs as well. So thank you for sharing those triggers. I really appreciate that. Is there any other comments or feedback that's come in so far about that?
Nothing. Oh, we did get one additional one. Just about, hold on one second, let me.
Sure.
That it can be hard to communicate with someone when they're constantly turning the conversation back to a personal agenda. And so for this person, that is a trigger for them too.
Yes, hold on to that, because we're going to talk about that a little bit more in some of our next slides. But so let me move on to the next one, but I'll come back to that particular scenario. So the next one is managing our emotions. And really, the first point on this is that our thoughts create our emotions. And I used to do a lot of stress management presentations back in the days. And there was one a storytelling piece that I used to share at the beginning of my stress management presentations. Basically, in Africa, they had this monkey trap. And in that monkey trap, it was kind of like a basket that was weaved pretty tightly. At the bottom of the basket, they would put food in there. And the top of the basket was very narrow. And so the monkey would put his hand inside of the basket to reach out for the food. And then he would try to bring his hand back up. But when it was in a fist, he couldn't pull his hand back out because his fist was stuck with the food in there. And ironically enough, a lot of the monkeys would be caught because instead of trying to let the food go and then to take their fist out and run away, they would stay there and hold on to the food and struggle really hard to try to get it out, and then they would get caught. And so the idea behind that is that, like, we get caught up and we get trapped in our thoughts. And a lot of times our thoughts become that cage where we hold on to them and we keep this fist and we keep holding on to those thoughts so hard that, they end up affecting our emotions and our thoughts and our behaviors, so on and so forth. So a lot of times when it comes to managing emotions, managing stress, all of those kinds of things, the root is really understanding and being able to control the thoughts that you're having. And I know that when it comes to like cognitive behavioral therapy and a lot of things that they use to deal with either depression or anxiety, a lot of it comes back to and stems to the idea behind just focusing on your thoughts and the types of thoughts you have and how to redirect some of that in more positive ways. So that's a big key to managing emotions. And so, also, being able to connect your emotions and having, those experiences, being able to manage your experiences and change them and be flexible as needed is very important to understand. But the key is that your thoughts influence your emotions and your actions. And so coming back to the root of that will help you ultimately to be able to address a lot of situations, especially in the cases where you may be triggered. So in other words, to become emotionally healthy, you must reconnect to your core emotions, become comfortable with them, and then practice mindfulness is another good example. So in those situations where your mind might be cloudy, you have a lot on your mind, you're very upset, you're very stressed, you're very overwhelmed, being able to understand ways on how to clear that mind to the point where you can start to make more solid decisions, be more calm, be able to manage your emotions is, a really good technique if you haven't already tried that. And then, emotional self-control is also necessary in delaying gratification. We're going to talk about motivation in a minute, but, in understanding gratification, that's part of that instantaneous reaction. So sometimes it's like, I'm angry, and so I'm so angry that I'm going to say and do things to anger you because that's how I'm feeling right now. And sometimes, that might work, but other times it might, especially in the professional situation, it might not be the best option, right? And then stifling those impulses, like how do we manage to just deal with the situation in such a way that we can address it in a calm manner? So I guess with that, the most important thing in understanding is like if you're in the height of emotions in a situation with someone else, and sometimes it might be parents who come in who are extremely frustrated and upset and are dealing with major issues of crisis, and you feel that projection, like they're projecting it on you, but that it's not because of anything you've done. It's because they are just so upset and so frustrated with the system and everything that they've been going through. Trust me, I've been in that situation as a parent myself, where literally have gone into school talking to the counselor almost in tears because I don't know what else to do. And so, as the professional in that situation, where you're dealing with the height of emotions of other people, being able to just manage your own emotions makes things so much easier. So sometimes it might require you to just stop, take a deep breath, walk away if necessary, or even, come back to the situation at a later point. But really being able to understand that if somebody's already coming highly charged with emotions, bringing your emotions on top of that is probably very rarely, if ever, going to make a situation better, in the sense that it's like a negative situation. So unless there's any questions or comments or thoughts, I'll move on to the next function, which is empathy.
No further questions have come in, but I am going to take this opportunity to read my second code word, which is the word flowers. That's plural, Flowers. Flowers is the second code word, and no questions.
Wonderful. Okay. So we'll move on to the next one, which is empathy. So, this is the ability to really put yourself in someone else's shoes. And I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard the word empathy before. But this is where you try to understand where people are coming from, how they feel, why they respond the way they do, and potentially their own triggers. The more you open up with your own emotions, the more people are, the more you'll be able to read and respond to other people's emotions, So, just having that awareness of I'm understanding why this family is feeling so upset and frustrated. And even though they might be yelling and screaming at me, or they might be super upset, I have to be able to understand where they're coming from in order to meet their needs and to be able to be productive in this conversation moving forward, So that's really just understanding where other people are coming from, which is a big piece of this. And once again, the reason why managing emotions is so important, because when you're under a lot of stress and you're very emotional, it's very hard, if not impossible, to spend the time or take the energy to really think about the other person and be empathetic in those situations. So once again, I'll be talking throughout this presentation about nonverbal cues, but in that, you can say to someone, oh, I understand what you're saying, versus, you know what, I really do understand what you're saying. So even the way you say things, the tone of voice you have, the gestures you use, the facial expressions, all of that stuff makes a big difference in someone really being able to trust and feel that you're very authentic about what you say and what you do. The next one is motivation. So this is another good one because, understanding the purpose for action is very important. So this is where empathy and motivation go hand in hand. It's important to understand your motives when you communicate, as well as the motives of other people. This is especially important when you know when it's best to just walk away. And I can give you, examples of that where someone is upset and you're trying to have a conversation, and no matter what you say or do, they're just in the intent where they're all about bringing their point. They want to make their point and that's it. Or it's really all about just expressing themselves and they don't care what you have to say or how you want to say it. And I think actually this goes back to someone's trigger that we just talked about earlier that I was going to defer to. So in those kinds of situations, you can argue, and I've been through this with my son and other people, where it's like you can go round and around and around, but at some point you realize that no matter what you say or do, it's not going to change because this person's stuck in where they are with either their emotions or their thoughts. So being able to really manage that, it's being able to say, you know what, their motivations is coming from a very unkind place and in a place that's very closed. And so we're not really going to be able to have either much of a conversation, a healthy conversation, or a conversation that's going to actually be productive. So this is where I think we need to just end it for now, because there doesn't seem to be any motivation to try to solve this situation, this problem, or communicate effectively, right? So that having that sense of motivation. And then on your part as well, if you're going to go and talk to someone and you know that it's with the total motivation of just being upset and just unloading on someone else or what have you, then you have to think about that as well, and that it's the same type of situation where what is really going to come out of that? Is there anything going to come out of it, or will I feel better for all of 5 minutes because I just left and threw my emotions out on another person, right? So that's the key to this one. And then, some of the other pieces are, don't make assumptions, right? Asking good questions will help you to avoid making assumptions and drawing the wrong conclusions. So even though some people may be annoyed by lots of questions, it might be helpful at times to be able to say, you know what, I just want to clarify. Is this what you're saying, or is this what you mean? Or you could even say, can you give me some more information so I really understand your perspective of where you're coming from? And the more that you know without trying to interpret what people are saying because they're actually explaining it to you, the better off that you are. Making assumptions is a problem when you believe those assumptions are truth without really knowing the truth. So, I'm sure we've all been in relationships where there was a miscommunication and someone said something and you misinterpreted it, and then all of a sudden found out later that's not what they meant or what they thought. So this would be a way of saying, let me not assume, and let me try to inquire and understand more versus just operating off of what I think I know, right? So that's motivation. So any more questions or comments or thoughts about empathy and motivation? Otherwise, I'll move on to the last of the factors.
And I'm seeing nothing in the question box.
All right. I hope it's not quiet because you guys know all this already.
I think we're all just
absorbing new information.
Absolutely.
It's awesome. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'll take that as well. All right. So moving on to the next one, which is social skills. And there's 3 aspects to this, and that's the ability to manage the emotions of others, social competence, and good communication. So it's kind of a roundabout of what we talked about, but being able to respond instead of reacting, and then the ability to handle social interactions effectively. That's getting along with other people, being able to form healthy relationships, respond in adaptive ways to different situations. So people who are more adept at social skills are people who are okay with approaching other people, talking to other people, being open, having conversations. And then, we have that factor of being introverted, extroverted, and the third one is ambivert. Have you guys heard of ambiverts before? I guess kind of a rhetorical question, but some may have not. And I actually am an ambivert. And my friends will say, "Oh no, you're an extrovert. You know, you're the type of person who's very outgoing, and you know, your locus of control is external, and all of that attention is more external in nature." Versus an introvert is someone who tends to internalize. They think, experience the thoughts and emotions internally before it becomes outward. An ambivert, on the other hand, is someone who actually can switch those off and on, where sometimes they're introverted, sometimes they're extroverted. And so it took me years of struggling in that. I would always tell people, no, I'm actually introverted by nature, because there's times where I literally close my door and I could go without talking to people for days and be happy. But by the nature of what I do for work, you know, I tend to do a lot of speaking and relationship building, communicating. So people who see me and who know me in a certain capacity, they can't imagine that I'm introverted. So it was really cool to find out about being an ambivert, because then it was like, yeah, there's times where I am extroverted, and then I become greatly overwhelmed with that, because just all the energy and attention emotionally that it takes to do that. And then other times where I just really truly want to just go into myself, and I will, you know, kind of internalize versus being external. So, and with that being said, those affect your social skills, not in a negative or positive way, just different ways, you know. So that's another thing that might be helpful, is for people to kind of understand where they are on that spectrum, and then how that influences the relationships and their ability to interact and socialize with other people, as well as communicate with other people as well. So yeah, those are actually all of the skills, you know. So the next thing that I want to go through is talking about the effects of emotional intelligence. So, you know, when it comes to emotional intelligence and work performance, high emotional intelligence can help you navigate through social situations, leading and motivating others, and actually in excelling through your career, because it helps you to maintain effective and healthy relationships, which is an important piece at work, because unless you work by yourself and you really don't communicate with any other person, and it's only you at all times, most of us have to deal with relationships. And by the nature of the business of the work that you all do, you're dealing with relationships all the time. So, you know, in general, it's just a win-win to be able to really understand emotional intelligence, how you can increase and really work toward higher levels of emotional intelligence. It will definitely increase your work performance in general. And then, you know, as it comes to physical health, you know, managing emotions equals managing your stress. So the more that you can support your emotional health by addressing your negative emotions and find positive ways on how to manage that, it will definitely influence and address a lot of physical effects that there are related to stress. So overall, having high emotional intelligence can improve your health simply by reducing the stress in your life. The next one is mental health. So uncontrolled emotions and stress can impact your mental health by making you vulnerable to anxiety and certain types of depression, right? So if you're unable to manage your emotions, it also can affect your ability to form relationships. And in turn, you know, if you're not able to form those healthy relationships to help to support you, it could lead to, you know, feeling lonely and isolated and even more stressed out. So increasing your emotional intelligence will help to further increase your mental health. And then in general, when we talk about relationships, you know, we already know that emotional intelligence is important to healthy relationships. So it allows you to communicate more effectively, forge stronger relationships in both work and in your personal life, when you can learn how to increase and master those competencies. And then lastly, as far as social intelligence, that's being in tune with your emotions. You know, it makes it easier to connect with other people. It allows you to recognize the difference between a friend or a person who might potentially be a foe or an enemy, and to assess a person's interest in you. And overall, just to feel a greater sense of love and happiness. Okay? So are there any questions about the effects or any of the different components of emotional intelligence that I presented so far?
None have come in.
Okay. All right. So if anything comes up, let me know. Move on to the next one. We've talked a lot about benefits of emotional intelligence, but this is just a quick highlight. So in other words, EQ or IEI, which is emotional quotient or emotional intelligence, allows you to gauge the situation, adapt as needed, and to come to a satisfactory resolution. So the idea is that I'm able to remove myself from a certain level of heightened emotion so that I could say, hey, let me assess and look at the situation at least a step or two back. And then, what do I need to do to make this situation work in a way that benefits hopefully a win-win situation? And then the nice thing about that is that when we're out of our emotions and we can control them, it allows us to be more flexible and dynamic. So we could say, okay, in this situation, I have thought through it, and this makes a better sense for me to do this or react this way or say this, versus when we're in that triggered response and we tend to be very instantaneous about our approach, we don't give ourselves the benefit of being able to adapt or to be flexible because we're just automatically reacting. And then those who leverage emotional intelligence have a greater ability to influence, persuade, and connect with other people. It's just a natural conduit to building relationships and increasing your social skills and your social network. And this is especially important in positions where you work with a lot of people, either to manage, to lead, to influence, or successfully engage in others. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to throw out some quick tips, and actually after that, I'd like to open it up to all of you to share things that were helpful for you. So as I'm walking through these, can you think about some other tips or examples that you can share with the group? Because I'd love to hear from you all as well, since I'm not the only expert in the room. I'm not an expert, actually. I'm just someone who's sharing from examples that I'm aware of. So, the first tip is read about interpersonal skills that you've like to improve and tackle one at a time. So as you've seen all of the different areas that I talked about, you might say, you know what, I'm really good at this and maybe not so good at this area. So it might be a good personal journey, a personal development. Say, what can I do better to address my triggers, to be more empathetic, to be able to understand where people are coming from, or just be more self-aware of myself, and spend the time and the priorities to do that, just knowing it's overall going to just enhance your life and make it better and the relationships that you have in your life. Next one is set aside time to examine your reactions to various situations and practice your response. So, like, I think going back to the situation with my son, he's 15, so we still got a ways to go. And I also have a son who's 21. So you think, for those of you who either don't have children or who have younger children, that the older they get and as they come closer to adults, that things get easier. But what I'm learning, and a lot of my, friends and colleagues who are in a similar situation, it doesn't always get easier. It just gets different and how you react and approach with those situations. But the idea behind that is that I am becoming more practiced in my conversations and in my interactions with my younger son, because I'm learning what his triggers are, what my triggers are, and what will actually allow us to move on from those conversations that are very non-productive and could potentially be hurtful, and get into more situations that, okay, let's get past them and beyond the motion, and let's get down to really understanding the heart of what we need to understand to move forward and help you to be successful, or help me to be successful. So, that kind of goes with that. Instead of rushing through decisions and reacting to situations, take a moment to pause and think. I just wanted to give you a kind of a funny example of this, is that my best friend, him and I are like brother and sister. So sometimes we'll squabble and fight, but it's all in love, right? And so he always says that I get on his nerves. And so one time we were sitting at a restaurant, and I was doing something, and I was annoying him. So he turns and he looks at the wall, and he stops talking to me, and he starts talking to the wall, and he's just like, this girl is really upsetting me. She's getting on my nerves. She's totally annoying me. And then I'm looking at him like, are you crazy? Like, why are you talking to the wall? But what I realized is that it was actually something that from then on in, him and I had as this inside joke, is like, don't talk to me, talk to the wall, right? So it's that example of, is like, in those situations, I've learned to start talking to the wall. And I don't necessarily do it in front of people like he did because we had that comfort level and, we're really close. But I've learned that there are times where instead of just reacting, especially if people aren't in the room and I might be on my computer, on an email or what have you, and I just want to tell this person how I really feel, I'm learning to start turning around and talking to the wall. The wall, I can say whatever I want, vent all my emotions and everything, and then let it out. After that, it gives me a chance to breathe and then be able to come back and share within a thoughtful and reflective way how I should respond and react to something that may trigger me. So I would encourage you all to consider in some situations, keeping it in the back of your head, don't talk to that person, talk to the wall. Another thing that I've heard, and some of you may actually do this, if someone says before you send an email out that might be very provocative, you might want to think about rewriting that email or social media message or what have you. There's different technologies out there, but at least, go through 2 or 3 versions or renditions of that email per se before you send it out. Or, I've had people contact me and say, hey, Eloiza, can you look at this because I have this situation, but I need an outside person to really look at this before I send it because, for whatever reason, it's nice to have that fresh set of eyes that could say, that might not be something you want to say, or that's not how you probably want to say that. And being an executive director, there's been times where I've had to deal with heated conversations with board members. It might not always be between me. It could be between a board member and staff or a board member and other board members. But, those are times where I've definitely had to use other people and how I respond or react to those situations. And it's been very helpful to bounce those ideas off. Another thing is using a journal. For those of you who love to write and who might be more internal in your reflections or self-reflections, being able to journal some of your thoughts, your feelings, or emotions, or just how things have made you feel or how you reacted or how you could react and do things differently. And then the next one's good communication requires that you build trust between yourself and that other person with whom you're communicating with. Because when you're communicating and you're expressing emotions, there is a level of vulnerability to that, right? So in those types of relationships that you have, which is with, families that you work with long-term or with colleagues or with board members, building a level of trust is going to be very important. And not only to your emotional intelligence, but also to just in general, good communication. Because then you can say to someone, you know what, like right now, I need some time to think about this before I say anything. Or, you know what, I better take a moment because I'm a little upset, let me talk through this and then I'll come back to you, or, let me say something candid to you because I trust you. I can share this with you without it going anywhere else, just so I can get it off my chest, those kinds of things. And then lastly, know when to bite your tongue to self-regulate. So that's going back to that whole motivation concept. Are you saying something for the purpose of just upsetting or, someone else, or to get something off your chest, or to prove your point that you're right, all those kinds of things. And even though you want to say it or do that, understanding when it's appropriate to do that and not will definitely make your life a lot easier, because it's always the ramifications of that are usually never good. If it's just for an intent that's only going to benefit yourself and most likely only benefit you temporarily. So I guess what I want to do is just open it now to so any other ideas, suggestions, challenges, thoughts that people have around some tips from all that I presented and just some of the things that you all come across. I hope that you have some ideas, because I'd really love to hear and encourage you to share.
Great. And while people are thinking about that, we did get some comments in about, really the importance of letting the negativity go, particularly in the line of work that we're in. We sometimes unintentionally go the complete opposite way with the empathy, and it can be very, very draining on us.
Oh, yes.
So really important to find other outlets, other ways of kind of diffusing some of that. So one of the strategies shared by a participant was, just taking a few minutes to, kind of unload, of course, adhering to the confidentiality of the consumer you were working with, but share the story so that it's not just completely on your shoulders. Whether it's sometimes getting up and taking a quick walk, stepping outside for a minute, maybe engaging in a quick meditation, something just to allow us to kind of disconnect from the sometimes very awful things that we hear when we answer the phone that families are telling us.
Yeah, and those are great examples. And what I would say to that is the concept of talking to the wall might also not include just like turning to the wall, talking to it, but also just taking that moment to yourself, right? To be able to just recoup, rebalance, re-energize, and just take care of yourself. And I agree with that wholeheartedly, 100%. It's very important, especially when you're in situations and in work scenarios that tend to be more emotionally draining and stressful sometimes and demanding. That's extremely important, that you figure out how to balance mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually in any way that you need to address that and deal with those situations. So thank you for whoever shared that. That's great insight. Is there anything else?
Nothing else at this point. Just want to give the heads up that we are looking at about 6 more minutes here.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, so the next couple slides are pretty quick slides, but things that I kind of just wanted to share, So the first one is multiple generations at work. And so basically, we're in an environment that we live where there's more than just one generation that is in the workplace at this point, And so the generations that we currently have that are in the workforce for the most part are the generation, baby boomers, born between 1943 and 1960. And then we have Generation X, and some of these vary with years, so it depends on what you're looking at. But for the most part, 1960s and 1980s. And then the millennials, or Generation Y, it depends on, what source you look at and how they label them. That's 1980s to the year 2000. Basically, one of the things that we're facing in the workforce today is the differences in communication among generations. The most dramatic change has to do with technology over the past 30 plus years. And it really affects not only how we communicate, but just our values and our interactions socially and all those kinds of things. And so, just understanding some of those things is very important. Baby boomers in general, this is very general, but they tend to be more appreciate and prefer more face-to-face modes of contact, right? And tend to be more direct in their communication styles. Millennials, on the other hand, the face-to-face contact is not necessarily the mode of approach for many millennials, in that a lot of it's done through social media, and more Twitter versions, not as lengthy in conversations and things like that. So the Generation X kind of has their foot in between both. So they have exposure to some of the technology and have some, understanding and are comfortable with some technologies, but then also are a little bit understanding of the values because of their parents being baby boomers, and also the face-to-face and, some of their styles on how they do things as far as social interactions. So it's important to understand and be aware of when we talk about empathy and, awareness of others and those kinds of things, that once again, our exposure, our interaction, our values, as well as age and experience all have an influence on how we perceive things and how we react to things. And it's going to be very important for us to be patient and also to be understanding, especially when someone of a different generation is coming at us doing things or saying things or understanding things completely different from us. So, that's kind of one of the pieces that I wanted to bring up. And the last 2 slides, it's just to share that, as we talk about self-management, which is really important to emotional intelligence, studies show that over time, with our experiences and with where we are in life and the more relationships and interactions we've had, it starts to increase, our self-management. But definitely not to say that someone who is a Generation Y or Generation X has any less ability or ability to master emotional intelligence. But there is something to be said about people having life experiences that also help to support their mastering emotional intelligence. So that's just one that related to generation, and then this is one related to age. But the bigger thing that I think is most important is that those generational differences do not necessarily have to be barriers. They can be opportunities, and the more that we put ourselves into the position where we understand other people and where they're coming from, I think we can reduce or eliminate a lot of the barriers related to some of the tensions of the different generations working together in the workplace. So is there any questions or thoughts or ideas around this? Otherwise, I'm going to come to close because I've literally got 1 minute left. But unless there's any more questions or thoughts, I'll share my last final slide.
And I don't have anything new in the question box.
Okay. All right, so you'll see one slide that just has resources. So it gives you a couple different places to go to learn more about intelligence, emotional intelligence, if you're interested. And here's the next slide has my information. Well, actually that was questions, but the last slide has my information. So if you want to reach out and you want more resources or have any more questions or comments or thoughts, please feel free to contact me. I would greatly appreciate it. And I really want to thank you all for your time today and for your participation in today's webinar.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a lot of information, a lot of great information. I just wanted to read that final keyword to folks. So the final keyword is beach, something I think many of us wish we were at today, the beach. I think, let's see, the only thing that's really come in, which I don't think, unfortunately, we're going to have time to talk about, but Eloiza, if you wouldn't mind maybe just shooting me an email response to this, I can forward it to the person who's asking. But someone is wondering what your take on mental health days in the workplace is. And so if you just want to shoot me an email with any thoughts you might have on mental health days in the workplace, that would be great. I think we're right at 2:00 Central Time, so we're going to wrap up and thank everyone for their time. Thanks, Eloiza, for a great presentation, and we'll chat with everyone soon.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.